Here is my perhaps ridiculous, time-consuming way of putting together my ink journal. Good morning, and welcome back to Stationery at 4. One of my favorite relaxing things to do with an ink purchase is to put it into my ink journal. And I say ridiculous and time-consuming only because I started in a particular way, and it takes time, depending on the characteristics of the ink, for it to dry in my ink journal. And I'll walk you through the entire madness to my process with respect to the ink journal. The journal that I use, and forgive the butchering of my pronunciation here, is Maruman Mnemsoyne. Mnemsoyne. It's a notebook that was gifted to me by my neighbor, and she went to Japan, and when she came back, she coincidentally and ironically gifted us a beautiful notebook. And this is really lovely Japanese paper. It has 70 sheets in this particular notebook. It is 80-gram paper. It is fountain pen friendly. The characteristics of the paper itself are fascinating. It has a little bit of formatting where it says title. It has a tear away ability out of the book. While it can hold a good amount of liquid on the page, it will bleed through, and it does show ghosting. So it's a thin paper, but for smaller writing here, it's completely fine. And the only reason I started with this notebook is because when she gifted it to me, I didn't really like the idea of the coil, just because the coil notebook reminded me of notebooks that you would find in an office setting. And for some reason that was off-putting. And so the notebook sat on my desk unused for a period of time. And when I started exploring inks and building up my collection a little bit, I wanted to develop a reference point for how the inks looked on paper in my collection, so that as I started changing and swapping out inks, then I could have a journal that I turned to. And I didn't really know what I was doing. I just knew I needed a notebook of some sort, and this was the one that I was least likely going to use for any writing sessions. For perhaps some very odd personal biases just against the coil aspect, I decided to start putting my ink collection into this book so that I can keep track of all the inks that were coming into my collection. Before I walk you through my ink journal, let me show you how I do a page in my ink journal. I place my notebook inside a tub to prevent splashback from what I'm about to do, and then the first thing I do is start with an ink splat. Unfortunately, this is out of focus, I apologize. But I take a syringe and I just fill up a little bit of ink. In this case, it's an Inkvent Arctic Blast. Inkvent 2022. And I just position it kind of on the top corner. And I'm going to do this in slow motion because I think this part's neat. And splat. I get my ink in there. I love the pattern. I just like the idea of wanting to start with an ink splat in my ink journal. And that's how that came to be. And I let it sit for a period of time. Depending on how much ink is in my ink splat, that can be anywhere from 5 minutes to an hour or two. And then I take a dip pen. This is a calligraphy pen, I guess, or a dip pen. It gives me the ability to write large and small because the tines split quite easily. And I just do a large writing sample indicating the specific ink here, and then who or which brand it's by. You can see in the ink splat, this one's a shimmer, and I like the ink splat because it shows the shimmer aspect, what kind of different shimmer there is, what kind of variation there is in the color. Even though this is kind of a blue, it can have a lot of red, as you can see. Then just a little bit of a writing sample. Sometimes I throw in a Sherlock Holmes quote just because that's a little inside joke my wife and I have. But in this case, I didn't. So again, just a little bit of a writing sample. And in this case, I'm just making sure to write the fact that this was from an Inkvent. And this is a specific type of style of ink from Diamine, in this particular case a chameleon. So the ink splat gives me the ability to see the shimmer, the writing, both large and small, allow me to kind of tell the difference on how the ink performs in various nibs. Sometimes I'll have a pen with a specific nib that I'll write with. And here I take a paintbrush. I know most people do this with cotton swabs, but in this case I take a paintbrush because that's what I had and I've stuck with it years now. And I paint across just to allow me to see what the color would look like over a long writing session. The paintbrush adds a consideration in terms of dry time. That'll take anywhere between 5 minutes to a few hours, depending on the ink properties. But it gives me the ability to see the sheens, shimmers, long writing session, and that's my 3-step, perhaps ridiculous process. The way I do my ink journal can be time consuming, and generally with the wetter inks in my collection, or inks that have really wet properties, the ink can be sitting on a page for a period of time before I come back and do the next step. And I've only recently gravitated towards trying to do all 3 things together. That is, starting out with the writing samples, secondly the paintbrush, and third doing an ink splat. And I have to be careful about that because the ink splat and the timing between all those 3 steps, if I don't space it out just enough, what I'll end up with is just a heavy mess on a page, and I've had to tear out 1 or 2 pages as a result of doing it like that. I don't think there's any right way of doing an ink journal. Just like the whole concept of fountain pens, it's a very personalized hobby, I think, and it can be very subjective. If you're interested in doing an ink journal, this is just one idea. I would encourage you, unlike me, to go check out the internet. There are some brilliant YouTubers out there who've got different ways of doing an ink journal. I've even seen individuals, and certainly at stores, stationery stores, where they will put the ink on little ink cards, ink slots, little cards. I'm not finding the right words here, but effectively that way they can compare their swatches against each other in a certain color category. Like a blue, you can have 2 or 3 different, or as many as you want, I suppose, different color swatches next to each other so you can tell. Let's take a closer look at the ink journal that I have here and do a bit of a flip through. And I'll talk you through all the inks that I own in my current collection. Starting with the first of my inks in my initial foray into inks. My first pen was a Faber-Castell Ambition Pearwood, and I was given Iroshizuku ink. This guy right here. This is the Take Sumi, and I used it all. It's a nice black ink, and that's all I wrote with. The first probably year of using a fountain pen was just black. I had no inclination or understanding to perhaps venture into different ink colors. So an entire year went by and I was using the Takesumi here. Fantastic, black, rich, deep. And when I got to the end of the bottle, and also being new to the hobby and not wanting to spend too much money, I wondered what it would be like to start exploring colors. Second color I bought was the Shin Ryoku, dark green. I just thought it was such a beautiful color sitting there on the shelf. By the way, the Iroshizuku bottles are absolutely fantastic. They're gorgeous to look at, in my opinion. Incredibly inviting. Have a lot of ink, 50 milliliters, and just look great. They run about 32 Canadian dollars. So this is a beautiful, dark, rich green, the Shin Ryoku. I use it quite a bit, and I'm about halfway through the bottle here. I loved it so much, I gifted a bottle to my sister, who loves green as well, when she got into fountain pens. My next venture here is the Herbin Encre Verte. Encre Verte. My French is atrocious. I hope that's right. And this is a light green, kind of a apple green. The bottle, nothing to write home about, kind of a standard bottle here. I wanted to get a light green, and you can see that my second attempt at my ink journal was a little bit more blotchy and a little bit more messy with respect to how that all kind of came together. I wanted kind of that light apple green. Truthfully, I have very sensitive olfactory lobes. I did not realize the perfume component. This is a scented ink. The scented component would be so strong. In the store where I was trying it, it was pretty light. and they didn't have any other light greens available to them from different brands. And I wanted a light green. So I bought this, brought it home, opened the bottle, and nearly threw up. I can't handle very strong colognes or perfumes, generally any amount of colognes or perfumes really. I haven't used this very much. I used it maybe once or twice. The neat thing about the scented aspect though is that it does tend to dissipate fairly quickly when exposed to air. It's a nice color though, in my opinion. It's got very interesting shading characteristics here. The next color that I tried out was a brown. This is the Iroshizuku Tsukushi brown. It's a nice chocolatey brown. It's got very little shading characteristics, I would say. It's just consistently rich chocolatey brown. Depending on the size of your nib, it can give a little bit more shading, but in the fines that I use, it's a pretty consistent writing experience. Just a nice espresso chocolate brown. This is a Kon Peki from Iroshizuku. Beautiful turquoise blue. It's got some shading characteristics. A little bit of variation from what I'd say a royal blue to a little bit more turquoise. Hint of red sheen in there, but very, very nice. I love this ink, and I tend to use it quite a bit in the summertime. This is another one of my favorite colors, and when I've been exploring blue now, I love the blue. This blue in particular, this is Tsukiyo by Iroshizuku. You take a look at it, it has some shading characteristics, which is pretty neat, even in a fine. There's a bit of variation there. It's got a little bit of red sheen to it, but honestly, it looks like I'm just staring out into the ocean. When I look at this ink, it's just so inviting to me. I love that deep, rich, dark blue, black, but not so black that it looks like a black ink, and not so blue that it looks like a royal blue. It's just like I'm staring at the ocean at nighttime. A wonderful ink. Then I got into, or tried I should say, the Ferris Wheel Press Storied Blue. I wanted to see what a lighter blue looked like, and this was one of the inks that kind of invited me into exploring that. Truthfully, I saw this bottle sitting on the store shelf and I went, wow, that's a really neat design. It's a beautiful bottle to look at. If I can just harp for 1 second on the bottle design, one thing I don't like about this is when you dip your pen into this bottle here, if you're planning to dip your pen into the bottle to fill up your ink reservoir in your pen, there's so much ink right to the top. When you dip it in, it can overflow, so just be mindful of that if you're planning to pick up one of these style bottles from Ferris Wheel Press. This is 38 milliliters and it ran for 28 Canadian. The Storied Blue, like I said, kind of my first venture into lighter blues, and I liked the look of it in the ink splat. I liked the look of it in the paintbrush, but I wasn't necessarily drawn towards it when it came to the writing experience. In my fine nibs, it looked very pale on my page. On a larger dip pen here, I found that yes, it did provide that shading, but it also very much relied on a pale backdrop. While I like the shading aspect, I like the what this ink was, didn't quite work out for me, so I don't actually use this very much, rare occasions. Then I went on to explore Diamine, and this is the Lavender Diamine, and it's a fantastic purple, just a rich purple. This was 17 Canadian dollars, and truthfully, while I like the richness of the color here, the lavender, I find that it doesn't behave so well in my pens generally. I've tried it in a number of different pens in my pen collection, and I find I struggle with just the gunking nature of it. You can kind of see it on the cap here. It tends to crust up if left unused for a period of time, which I wasn't necessarily a fan of because I don't use purple as a consistent ink. And when my writing experience, I did ink up a Lamy All-Star purple with this guy. I left it perhaps for a week unused, and the nib was just completely crusted up and had a lot of precipitate in there. Unfortunately, it's not a frequently used ink in my ink collection, but I love it. It's just a rich, consistent purple. Has a tiny bit of shading and characteristics in there, but it's just a purple through and through. The next guy that I tried out here, and this is one of my favorite reds of all time, is a Red Dragon. This is from Diamine as well. Love the richness of the red in this. I love the name, just Red Dragon. The richness in this color is lovely in my opinion, just really invitational. Has a little bit of shading, but it's just a very consistent red in my writing, especially in the fine nib. The next one here is an Ancient Copper, and I love this ink. This has some interesting characteristics. It has browns, chocolate browns, dark browns. It's got a rich dark red, and it also has kind of a planter's orange. I'm struggling. A clay orange. There we go. Clay orange. A clay orange involved. So it's a very dynamic ink. And in my dip nib here, it tended towards a lot of the rich, dark, black red in the writing, with a hint of the clay and the reds, the lighter reds showing up. My fine nib, I found that it actually started off more on the lighter red and gravitated towards the darker as you wrote more and more. And with a consistent writing session, it just varied from the light to the rich red to the black, back to the light reds and the clay. Very dynamic ink in my opinion. Love writing with this ink. The only downside I find with my Ancient Copper, and I should actually look this up, is like the lavender prior to from Diamine, this one can precipitate heavily, crust up very easily, and actually clog my pens that I put it in, to the point where I have to run it underwater, do a little bit of nib flushing in order to get this ink to get writing again in my pen. So from a behavior perspective, I find it difficult. And I'm curious if you find Ancient Copper difficult for you. This guy here is the Autumn Oak from Diamine. I just wanted a nice dark purple, and I got it. It's a beautiful purple, very much in line with the fall season or autumn. It has some characteristics of yellow, darker oranges, but more importantly, just a nice variation of the fall colors all in my writing experience here. Really like it. On the large dip nib, very much tends towards the darker orange, and in my fine nib it starts more on the light and kind of stays around there with a little bit of shadow shading with respect to the darker orange showing through, which I really like. And painting, I just love that there's so much variation that shows through. Here's Golden Honey. This is one of my favorite inks, and favorite yellow ink in particular. And it's also a 150 year edition of this ink. Very cool with respect to the bottle design for this, and I just really like it. It's a gorgeous ink. What I really like about this ink is the rich. I generally tend to shy away from yellow inks because I find them to be pretty light, but this yellow in particular I really gravitated towards because it has just such a rich yellow in there. And the yellow variation that tends towards an orange from time to time in the writing experience. I use this considerably in the autumn season and sometimes in the summer as well. I just like that yellow. Next one in my list here, next one in my collection here is a Diamine Earl Grey. Really like this ink as well. Behaves pretty well in my pen, and I love the richness of the black and the shadow of the lighter grays showing up here. It's a very nice shading ink in the larger nibs. In the smaller nibs in the fine, I find it tends towards the lighter gray and kind of hovers there for the entire experience, with the occasional shadow of the dark gray showing through. Really love this ink. I think it's one of my favorites, truthfully. After trying out Diamine for a little bit, I started exploring Robert Oster inks. And this is a Gray Seas Blue. The Robert Oster bottles of ink, they're beautiful bottles made of recycled plastic. They're 50 milliliters. And it doesn't look that big when you look at the actual bottle here. But it does hold 50 milliliters of ink. They run for about 24 Canadian dollars. I love the Gray Seas in here. I think it's a fascinating invitation into a blue. On the larger size nibs, it's got that rich dark gray blue that it tends towards. And on the lighter fine nibs, on the fine nibs, it sticks on the lighter end of the blue and shadows or shades every now and then into the darker blues. It's got a little bit of pink in the color makeup there, a little bit of pink sheen So it has a kind of an interesting blend of grays, light blues, dark blues, and pink, and a very interesting color that shows up on my paper for longer writing sessions. Love that it's dynamic as it is. The Robert Oster inks I find to be just a touch on the drier side compared to the Iroshizukus and the Diamines. Consistent writing experience though. I really enjoy the gray seas here. This is one of my favorites. This is Fire and Ice from Robert Oster. It's a teal, turquoise, more so on the teal side, blue. And it has, this was my first experience of a good sheening ink where it just had so much red sheen that shows through. Interestingly enough, I didn't do a fine writing example in here. That's odd. I really like the dynamic of the light blue to the dark blue in my writing experience. It changes constantly as I write for long writing sessions. Here is a Peppermint from Robert Oster. This was an attempt to experiment with red sheen in my dark green. An interesting buy in the sense that I found that while it does show red sheen characteristics, my writing experience with it was just very dark green, almost like these Shin Ryoku that I already own here. And while there is hints of light green in there, it just tends to write as a dark green. And so I didn't get that color variation as much in my writing experience as I had hoped. Here's a gorgeous one. I really like the deep blue blacks in terms of the blue spectrum. This was kind of where I was hovering around the blue for a period of time. This is the Great Southern Ocean from Robert Oster, and it is gorgeous. It has some red sheen in there, very light red sheen, but it's just a rich, deep blue black, and I like that. Again, for some reason, I think I must have done this in a few days in a row here, because I did buy the Robert Osters kind of back to back. I did not write a smaller writing example. I'll have to come back and clean that up. Interestingly enough, what I like about the Great Southern Ocean is that deep blue black. Because of that medium kind of dry flow, I find that it tends to have a very different experience to the Tsukiyo in my Iroshizuku. And of course that's expected as I'm comparing the two inks and just the characteristics. But I find that I like writing with the Great Southern Ocean for short sessions, and I tend to rely on the Tsukiyo for longer writing sessions. This is a Diamine Golden Ivy, and this is a shimmer ink. I actually was not interested in shimmer inks for various reasons. I had heard that they can be difficult to work with, just stayed away from them. But my wife really wanted a green. Her favorite color is kind of a deep green. She really wanted a shimmer ink for her pen. This is a Golden Ivy Diamine Shimmer ink, and it is gorgeous, I must say. It actually behaves pretty well for a shimmer ink. She's left it in her pen unused for weeks on end, and it actually tends to flow pretty well. Occasionally she has to run the nib underwater, but generally it works fantastically. It's a pretty well behaved ink. This has got some interesting characteristics in the ink splat here. It has sheens of red. The shimmer is a gold in this, and it's got a nice dark green backdrop. In a writing experience on the fine, it tends to hover towards kind of the middle spectrum of green and shimmers like crazy with respect to larger nibs or longer writing sessions. That gold will really come through, and then the variation of the red sheen. It's a fascinating and quite dynamic, and my wife really enjoys it. My introduction into a heavy sheening ink, and I love it. This one is very bold, very dynamic, and this is actually from an Inkvent from years ago from Diamine. This is the Diamine Holly. It is amazing. It's a green that heavily sheens towards a red, and on the larger nibs here you can see that it hovers around the red, but on the fine and writing experience it has a nice variation of the green to a red, and it's a kind of a teal green that goes into a darker green that really morphs into a rich dark red. Now this is interesting. I don't have a bottle for this one. This is a Ferris wheel press Beaver Dam Brown. This was a ink sample that was gifted to me. Honestly, I used half of the ink sample in doing the ink splat, but it wasn't a brown that particularly spoke to me. So I haven't actually used the other half. It's got a little bit of shimmer in there, but no real variation in the brown. I find it's just a kind of a glossy dark brown. Another gift to me here was the Kyanite du Nepal by Jacques Herbin. I love saying that, Jacques Herbin. This one I really like, and I might have to pick up a bottle for myself. This is a Kyanite du Nepal again, and it's a shimmer ink. It sheens red. It has a nice silver shimmer in there with a hint of yellow. And then I kind of took a long break from ink purchases. It's just because it was kind of becoming a bit of an expensive hobby with constantly buying ink. This one here, though, last year I got into the Inkvent calendar and decided to check this out because a lot of people told me the Inkvents were really neat ways to experience a lot of different inks very quickly. And I'm just going to blast through these. It's funny because I wrote 2023 here, but actually this was the Inkvent 2022. And they come in little ink bottles like this. This is a blush. It's nothing crazy, in my opinion. It's kind of a nice turquoisey blue. Some shading in there with respect to a variation from the turquoise to a darker blue. Has some green in there that it kind of tends towards. It's a nice color. I just don't think I would use it very much. Currently, it's inked up in my Pilot Kakuno. This is the Arctic Blast. I love this color. It's a nice royal blue that has a heavy shimmer component here of silver. Diamine calls this a chameleon ink. I just think it's amazing. You can see the variation in the light there. Purple, blue, red ink with heavy silver shimmer in it, and it sheens like crazy. I put this in my pen and I really like it. The only issue that I found was exactly what I feared when I was intending to stay away from shimmer inks, is that it would clog my pen pretty easily. So I didn't enjoy that aspect of the experience very much. Great for the holiday season, but not for longer writing sessions or leaving it in my pen for longer. While I like the shimmers in general, I don't like it for longer writing sessions. I find that the shimmer on my page, personally, this is a subjective experience, of course, can be a bit distracting. So when I'm looking at pages and pages of shimmer ink, I don't necessarily enjoy that. Short writing sessions works for me. Here is Diamine Once Upon a Star. And by the way, I should note, for those of you who have a 2022, love this color as well, Upon a Star. A nice dark blue black, a little bit of sheen variation from green to gold to silver. It's kind of a different sort of mix of shimmers in there. This is the Serendipity. Again, just a very dynamic ink. It's got a blue base, but a very interesting kind of brown, rich red shimmer going on there. And the writing experience actually starts off as a very strong red, and I'd have to write a whole page to give you the full effect, but eventually the blue comes out. And so Silent Night here, kind of a standard ink from Diamine. Nothing to write home about, just a blue-black, in my opinion, with a little bit of gray touch in there. Here's a Solar Storm, so now we're getting into the purple spectrum of the ink set. I really like this one because it had just a fascinating shimmer in it, which was gold and silver, but it looks like it starts off writing black and then gravitates towards the purple, the shimmer following through. Here's Deck the Halls. This one I wasn't so much of a fan of. It just, while it is a purple ink, just wrote consistently as a dark black, in my opinion, or a dark purple tending towards a black. It does have shimmer in there, a red shimmer, as you can see. I didn't find it to show through, so from that perspective, perhaps good, but Jingleberry, a lighter purple, didn't speak to me. I don't find I enjoy that variation on my color on my longer writing sessions, even short ones. Actually, it didn't particularly speak to me in any shape or form, but an interesting color nonetheless. This is Diamine Ghost. This was a fascinating ink for me because I thought actually that it was a purple, but it writes very much like a gray. You can see that the sheens of pink and blue in there. Here's the Diamine Memory Lane. This is a shimmer ink, purple with heavy amount of silver and, yeah, just silver actually. Diamine One More Sleep. This is kind of an interesting variation of purple, pink, blue. Yule log. This is a brown with, I tend to gravitate towards the darker yellow browns, and I thought this was an interesting one to tackle here. Here is a dusted truffle, which is a brown with a heavy amount of silver. I had trouble even just ink splatting this one actually and writing with it just because the silver shimmer showed up so brilliantly. More silver shimmer than ink almost, it seemed. This is Diamine's Pick Me Up, and this is a brown that sheens towards a green. I didn't find the green to show up very much, so I was a bit disappointed in the sheening characteristics here. It's not a very heavy sheener, I would say. It just writes like a very dark brown with the occasional hint of a green. This was one of my favorites that came out of it. This is the Diamine Three Kings. Like I said, I gravitate towards the darker yellows, and this is kind of a nice, rich, dark mustard yellow with brown component to it. And I love the writing experience. It shades like crazy. This is the Diamine Spiced Apple. I love this one. This is a red ink with a gold shimmer. The shimmer and the ink are well balanced. So every writing experience I've had with this ink, the ink and the shimmer are proportionate, which I find is really neat. On the bigger nibs, the shimmer very much shows through. This was a Diamine Celebration. Not a fan of this one. This one was a pink with a very red shimmer introduced into it. Not my favorite. I love the Diamine Cardinal here. I thought this was really gorgeous. A rich red. Some shading characteristics in here as well, between a dark red to a light red. Here's Diamine's Cozy Up. Didn't quite speak to me, truthfully. I thought it was too pink for me, but interesting. Diamine Flame. This was perhaps my least favorite ink in the Inkvent. It just looked like an orange, truthfully, and nothing to write home, in my humble opinion. The Diamine Olive is one of my favorite discoveries in the Inkvent collection from last year. It's a rich olive green with a heavy green, yellow, gold shimmer to it. Writing experience is crazy. It's got that olive green base, but the dynamic between the gold and the green shimmer that comes out is pretty fun to see play out in the writing experience. This is a Diamine Spruce. Nothing to write home about. It's actually a scented perfume, so I even wrote scented. I didn't like it. It feathers like crazy for some reason on this particular paper. Didn't think too much of the ink, I should say. Here's a Diamine Appletini. Beautiful light green ink. Loved it. Truthfully, I thought it had some nice, interesting shading characteristics of a yellow to light green to a dark green that showed up in there. This one was one of my favorite ones again. This is the Diamine Alpine. And what's interesting about this is there's so much shimmer in the ink that I actually thought it was a gray ink, and I even put it into my gray TWSBI. So much shimmer in the ink that it looks like a gray ink, but actually it's got a very strong green component. And this is kind of the culmination. So at the end of the Inkvent, you get larger size bottle. This is Best Wishes. I gotta be honest, I was a bit disappointed in the culmination, perhaps is the best way to say it. It's an interesting ink. It's a green that has red, that has silver shimmer to it. Silver, gold, green. It sheens heavily. It goes from that mossy green to the darker reds, and at the same time it just wasn't something that resonated with me compared to the Inkvent of past years, like the Diamine Holly here. Really like this guy. This was the culmination or the final ink on the 25th day. Here is the Robert Oster Van Pen 86. When I was in Vancouver last year, I had a chance to pick this up from the Vancouver pen shop. This is a special exclusive ink made specially for them. It's an interesting ink. It writes as a brown gray. It's pretty subdued. Here's the Watermelon Mysterious Blue. This was a recent purchase, and I really, really like this ink. It has a component of red sheen in it, although it's fairly subdued in the writing experience. And what's interesting about this is the shading as well. Here you can see that the light blue has come across, and in another different pen with the fine nib, the darker blue comes across. As they say, it lives up to its namesake, mysterious. I'm not sure what you're going to get, but it's a nice blue overall. And I do use it in a professional setting as well, which I think is really great. The last ink in my ink swatch journal here, Diamine Majestic Blue. I really like this ink. It's a gorgeous ink. Royal blue ink with a heavy red sheening component to it, and the writing experience is quite fascinating. It's got that deep underlying blue with the hint of the red consistently showing on every up and down stroke, which I really like. And there you go. That is my ink journal. And this one just finished up with that recent purchase of the Majestic Blue there. There's no right way of doing an ink journal, and I've reached the end of my journal here. I think the next, I'm debating. Either I might pick up another Maruman Mnemsoyne and do that all over again, or just to change things up, I might pick up one of my favorite notebooks, which is a Midori A5, plain, and do it differently. Maybe I'll do it block by block in terms of just little components, or maybe I'll dedicate an entire page to one ink, but just write as I change through different nib sizes and different pens what the characteristics or what the ink looks like in each of those pens. Going through the entire journey of start to finish of an ink journal was pretty fascinating for me, because at the start, where I had no idea what I was doing or what I was looking for in an ink, I just thought it looked great. It helped us more and more. My 3 steps that I do, which really allowed me to hone in on what I think is important for me in terms of being an ink connoisseur, I suppose, for lack of a better term. But really the things that I look for is the characteristics of the ink in terms of sheen and shade. I think those are what really makes an ink quite dynamic for me. If this was at all interesting or helpful, or allowed you to make some considerations of some of the inks that I own and you might want to pick up, please consider clicking on the like and subscribe buttons below. Thank you so much for your support. It's been a fantastic journey. I never thought in a million years when I started this channel a year ago that I would be where I'm at, and that there would be lovely individuals in this community who are incredibly supportive and encouraging. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye for now.